Hey there, welcome to the archives. Um, I'm not really in the mood today, but I wanted to get on here and I watched the telepathy tapes, so I just wanted to talk about that. My initial reactions, my mind is still blown. Like my mind is really still blown. Um, I made a couple notes. The first thing was it is really hard to believe. I mean, I am somebody who does actually believe it. Um, but like I still found it really hard to believe. And so I just can understand where and how other folks might be in disbelief and think that it makes sense why people don't believe it. It's out of the status quo framework. It's definitely out of like our North American um Eurocentric kind of context. It collapses everything that we've been told, right? Outside of like science fiction. Like we can get down with it if it's Star Trek, but real life, that's not. It's not. So, which is really interesting because there is the idea that we as humans are creative enough to write about it, think about it, perform it as fiction, right? But somehow that is disconnected from the real world or real life, which I find very very interesting. Um, it talked about like materialism, right? A lot of scientists can't get behind it because it's like, well, we can't see it, and what can't be measured and proven is real and true is therefore not real. Um, which is very limiting. It's very, to me, that's very small minded. Um, and they talked about that in the podcast, right? I can't read minds, at least not like that. I do believe in telepathy. I try not to talk about telepathy online. My entry point into these kinds of conversations came over a decade ago. 2013, 2014, when I was doing my PhD around emotions. And I wanted to know, like, how are people moving through emotions? How are they navigating emotions? And that brought me to the spiritual community, to the New Age spiritual community, specifically the twin flame communities. That's where I started to hear about telepathy, right? You hear about these quote unquote twin flames that are communicating together telepathically. And I found that really cool. Um, right. As an Afrofuturist, I was really, whoops, careful, mama, careful. I was really interested in what that looked like. And if it was real, I wanted to know, like, exactly like a lot of people are saying, like, is this real? Is this true? Like, what are you talking about? What do you mean telepathy? What do you mean you can hear people? And so, ever the curious, inquisitive person that I am, that's what was my introduction into these kinds of conversations. It wasn't through autism, although it brought me to autism. And then for me to even question myself if I was autistic, because I was like, this is very familiar. This experience is very, very familiar. It feels very much like home. It feels like this is the most me. Um, and so, yeah, I'm really interested in that. That's how I came to it. I think it's totally cool. I think like, these are some of the coolest people on earth, I think. Um, right? Because you're getting us to push beyond what it is that we've been told, which is why it just unravels everything. Because if you've been lying, if they were wrong about this, like what else were they wrong about? Right? I've seen like a few articles that were bashing it, and I think that's just fear. That's just fear. If you don't know what these people are talking about, fear of the unknown is real, right? Rather than being like, wow, this makes me feel really insignificant. This makes me feel really left out. This makes me feel really inadequate for not understanding what it is that they're talking about. Rather than sitting with that discomfort of feeling like an outsider, especially if you are like a white man who's used to being the center, who's used to being the authority, who's used to, right? Everybody believes what it is that you say. if you are outside of that, that's very jarring. And rather than being like, wow, I need to sit with these emotions, then it becomes projection. Now it's a lot of like infantilization. Oh, these kids, and they're childish, and it's fantasy. I had my mom tell me once it's wishful thinking, and that I heard the same thing come up in the podcast, and like that, all of that makes sense, right? If that is your worldview, if that's all you know, that makes sense. Because I was there once. I was like, what are you talking about? What are these people talking? Like, you sound ridiculous. This is not real. This is not Star Trek. This is not sci-fi. It's not Octavia Butler. What are you talking about? Right? So it doesn't make sense. But the future is here. The future is here. A lot of people are showing us that, like, it's, again, we expect flying cars, but telepathy is where we draw the line. So a flying car is there. AI is there. These robots that are going to attack us soon. These robot dogs, like, that's all normal, but we have a hard time believing that humans. So like Elon Musk and his team are coming up with a program where they can connect the mind to the computer, but we can't connect the mind to another mind. Like, it's just, come on, right? The future's here. I wasn't prepared either. So when I see people really just having a hard time with it, I get it. Because I was not prepared. I think I wrote a paper being like, the future, that was supposed to be one of the chapters in my PhD dissertation. The future is here, and I was not prepared, right? And this was back in 2015. Now we're in 2025. That's 10 years later. And now we're finally having these conversations in a way that's less stigmatizing, I think, more affirming, and normal, right? Yeah, and part of my PhD when I was doing it and like learning and paying attention to these online communities, because ethnography is one of the things that I did, right? I was doing ethnography, which is you're studying cultures, you're studying people, you're studying how they communicate, uh, which is not anthropology per se. I did more from a sociological perspective, but there is anecdotal evidence, right? Everybody, like they said in the podcast, everybody can't be making this up. Like, and if we are, then what are you going to do about that? Right? There's a lot of anecdotal evidence. Just even from the twin flame communities, what I was seeing, I was like, are these people telling the truth? Right? The speakers, the spellers blew my mind. Just way more advanced than anything I ever saw in the twin flame communities, way more advanced than anything I ever experimented with. Just really advanced, just very, very, very advanced. Like, you are where we're going, right? This is where humanity is going, and if you can't get on board, you're going to get left behind. And people are getting left behind, and it's making them really angry. They want to make it great again. They can't fathom anything beyond, like, you can, why are we going backwards? This future is here. Let's move into the future. And I think that's what they're trying to do, is usher us in. But we refuse to have people like that lead because of ableism, right? And that's what they said in the podcast. There's this assumption that they're incompetent because they cannot speak verbally. Because they cannot communicate the same way as us. We look at them as inadequate, as small, as like the R word, right? All of these able terms, all of these words are there that we call folks. And like, I've been called that as well too. And you have to also recognize, this is why it was so important to do the emotional work. Because once you're able to like really do that work and you don't need that external validation, you see, like, I pity people that are like, oh, right? Because you're just like, oh, that you don't know what to do with this, right? That very low vibrational, it makes sense. I study shame. Shame is one of the lowest vibrations, which is why I study, because so many of us are caught into it. I was caught into it, right? And it's very toxic. I've never been more toxic in my life than when I was deep, deep, deep in shame. I've never been so problematic than when I was deep in shame and fear. I've never been so chaotic than when I was stuck in these, like, and I'm still stuck in these lower vibrations. I mean, if any of us think we're like so much more elevated, I would question that, right? Because like, as within, so without. But yeah, my concerns was around sensationalism. It becomes this thing where it becomes such a like a positive, cool experience that we like kind of, the negatives, the downfalls, the harmful elements, the physical pain, the isolation, the stigma, the loneliness, the suicide, right? The suicide ideations, the actual suicide attempts, the actual suicide successes, right? Not just the fails, but the successes. Like those are all really real parts that I think was not as elaborated, and for good reason, right? Because I don't think that was necessarily the main focus. It's also like the super crypt narrative, which is what I think a lot of ableist people are struggling with, right? Like all, and I think it was Jonathan Jerry. I read an article where it was kind of like, oh well, all of these autistic kids who are like kind of like shunned now, they and their parents have an opportunity to be cool. Like it was just like, but like that's so ableist. Why did you even start with the foundation that they were beneath you? And now this makes them cool that they're trying to raise. It's like they're clout chasing, they're lying, they're attention seeking, right? These are some of the things we see. Okay, but your article bashing them, that's not our attention seeking. Um, right? The super crypt is this idea that like folks who are disabled, being inspiring, being overcoming their disability, right? The person that gets a prosthetic legs and is finally able to walk, they did it, and we're like, yeah. And anybody that's still in a wheelchair, we're like, oh, you're not trying hard enough. That's not always a way, and that can actually be really problematic if you think about it. So I was also thinking about like the freak show, right? Eli Clear writes about this. Like you become a freak show. It's almost like a circus. But yeah, it's just you become a freak show. It makes the supernatural element of it, therefore projects you as like no longer human. And then people are already dehumanizing you because they don't see you as human, right? You become relegated as like fiction, as supernatural, as something that is otherworldly, but like we're still very much humans living in this world, navigating here, there, nowhere. Um, and I don't think, I think that kind of maybe was not as upfront about it. There's an element of like exploitation, especially for like folks who are nonverbal and don't speak and um, don't even spell, or even the spellers. Like I'm always wary of like the exploitation. Not to say that the podcast did this, but just in general, right? Autistic folks tend to be bullied more than the average person. The experiences they go through are absolutely treacherous, right? Because especially with nonverbal folks, where we have this assumption that they're not in there, right? There's nobody in there. There is a vegetative state, like very ableist. Um, the infantilization, right? They become childlike, like, oh, they're just children when it's like a grown adult. But because they might be delayed developmentally, we assume like they're always stuck as a child. Um, Surveillance, right? I am worried about surveillance just because I know when I started talking about these things, I feel like that's when I was most surveillanced, because people are trying to test you. People are trying to see how, like, they don't understand you. And what we don't understand really terrifies and fears. We're afraid of it. So I was really concerned about surveillance for them. Like, what does that look like? Suicide ideations. I questioned if one of the stories, how it ended in death. I was like, is that a suicide? I wasn't sure. But because it was such a positive thing, it wasn't, I don't know. But what I did love about it was like just a reminder that you can't pull a fast one on people like that. You cannot pull a fast one on somebody like that. And when you live in a world where transparency is very, very threatening to certain people, right? When we're used to hiding, when we're used to masking, where shame keeps us covering things, it can feel like an invasion of privacy. And again, I wrote about this maybe a decade ago. I don't know where it is. But it feels like an invasion of privacy. Like, how did you know this thing about me? I never told anybody. How did you know that about me? Right? And then it's like, well, is this psychic abilities, and then are psychic abilities real, and is it pseudoscience? And you just go down that rabbit hole. But you can't pull a fast one on somebody like that, right? Because it's like, I hear what you're saying, but I'm clocking something differently. I'm clocking something differently, and you're telling me that I'm crazy, but I think you're gaslighting me maybe. And if you're somebody who has really porous boundaries, terrible boundaries, if you don't know how to speak up for yourself, advocate for yourself, if you're a people pleaser like I was, you believe them. If you were taught to trust people more than you believe them, right? So you're not believing that what I heard was right. I had one of my aunties who raised me when my parents left and I was still in Ghana. I had an auntie that was raising me, and I talked to her years ago, maybe a decade ago when all of this was coming out. And she told me a story about how she and I went to somebody's house, and I refused to go into the house. I was a little girl. I came to Canada when I was 6, so it had to be, I was either 4 or 5. And I refused to go into their house. And I just knew, I just was like, the man is not, the vibes are off. And later on, she was telling me that, like, yeah, it turned out the guy was a terrible guy. He was an abuser, just awful. But, like, I didn't know, but I just knew I didn't want to go in there. At 5 years old, 4 years old, I don't know how old I was, but she was telling me that story. And as a child, you get in trouble for that, right? Because you're misbehaving, you're making the adult look bad. They're not seeing that as you paying attention to the environment. They're not seeing that as you being extrasensory. They're not seeing that as you being tapping into something, right? They don't see that as you closer to God. And so maybe what if God is warning you, this child, about this? They don't see that as that. Our culture sees that as deviance, as bad, as acting out, as witchcraft, as demonic, which is why the last point I'll touch on is this. I see why. I never understood. For me, my own life, I never realized how threatening I was to the state and to these systems until I listened to episode 10. Hearing the spellers themselves give us next steps, I was like, oh, yeah, this is why the school boards don't want you spelling. Because now we're hearing more of you talk this way. It makes sense. It's very, very threatening. And I heard that over and over with the censorship. People were losing, it was very much like speaking out against Israel. It's like, that's a huge no-no. You will lose your job. Your reputation will be ruined. You will be cast out. They will make you look so ridiculous that no one even wants to mess with you anymore. And that's really interesting, because when we see it with Palestine and Israel, right? The ceasefire was called yesterday. I don't know. I'm just not saying anything because I'm not Palestinian, but there's just something very it just feels very, you're waiting 3 days, the stipulations, people are still being killed, bombs are still being dropped, right? Like, but we saw it. We saw the censorship, how censored talking about critiquing Israel is. Something similar here, which is really scary. Like, what is it about these speakers, these spellers, that is so threatening that teachers are losing their jobs? Psychiatrists are losing their jobs. Scientists are afraid to speak up. What is that? What is that? Is it a threat to the state? We have to ask why. I tend to ask why. Why is it a threat to the state? Because it crumbles everything. It crumbles everything we've been told. Everything we've been told just kind of just disrupts. And for me, I think the answer is because it's Indigenous technology. This is Indigenous technology. This is Afrofuturist technology. This is, and now it's like you have, autism is often framed as like a white men thing, right? Black girls aren't autistic. They're lying. We're lying about it. We're attention seeking. We're playing victim, right? It's a very like white male dominated thing. So now you have like white men that are claiming to speak telepathy. Oh yeah, right. No, they don't want that. They don't want that. Who's they? And then it's like psychosis, hallucinations. Now you've got schizophrenia and the whole and not to say that schizophrenia is not real, but that blurring of the line, the way in which Western psychiatry desperately needs to pathologize it because it doesn't understand it, that is very colonial, right? I don't know. It just reminds me of stories I heard about the old ways growing up. It was very sci-fi, like stories my dad would tell me about the old ways. It's not of this world, right? It's not of this world. And that scared the Europeans when they came to our places, when they came to our lands. They were like, what is happening here? Your women are in leaderships? We have to get consent from these native women before we can sell? What? The European men were like, I'm not getting consent. I'm not going to this woman to get permission. What the? Introduce Christianity. Give them the Bible. Give these people the Bible. Right? Tell them that it's wrong. This is not how it's done. That's all I see. It's just like they're not going to let you spell because they didn't let us speak. They criminalized these things. A lot of these things were not, they were banned. It was banned. Even drumming was banned. They wouldn't even let us drum. We couldn't even enjoy. We couldn't even laugh. It was banned. It was criminalized. These things were criminalized. We could not drum because they thought, they knew the drumming is technology. We're communicating via drumming. They criminalized drumming. You think they want you thinking about telepathy? They won't even let us drum. We could not even play on our... Oh, my bad. We could not even drum. Okay? Drumming was a threat. How weak. How weak. Because they can't strategize with that. How do we can't, we have to shut it off. They criminalize that. We don't know how to go up against the drums because we don't know what they're communicating. These people are they're sending a message to the drums. Shut it down. Shut it down. And I don't know if people were making those connections, but those are the connections I was making. Oh, this is indigenous technology. This is what they said was demonic. Oh, this is what they banned. And now it comes up in a different form, in a different way, in a different shape, in different bodies. Specifically, a lot of it, like when they started, it was Mia from Mexico was the first one, right? And I was like, oh, the brown girls, not the brown girls entering the conversation. And then they moved to Akil in India. It's like, oh, not the brown boys entering the conversation. They're not going to want to believe what black and brown people are saying, which is what was happening, I think. And now that's happening to more white people, which is when anything ever gets any attention. No one ever cares until it starts happening to white people, right? Now that we have more and more white people with anecdotal evidence of telepathy, they're like, oh my God. They don't know what to do with themselves. They don't know what to do with themselves. But my mind was blown. My mind was blown. My mind was blown. I love the love for the water. Yes, the water, right? Again, indigenous technology. I think I was, Leanne, I was reading, it's not coming to me right now. But it was talking about one of the indigenous tribes here in Canada, the communities. Somebody was saying when they were growing up, their grandfather, I think it was their grandmother, their grandfather would go to the water every day to talk to the water. And to me, I was like, that's wisdom. It's not lost on me that when the spellers are talking, they're talking about their love for the water, the love for the elements, for nature. There's a humanitarian, it's very Age of Aquarius. We're in the Age of Aquarius now, and you're seeing what's happening. Everything is falling. Masks are falling off. Everything is it's very Age of Aquarius, right? And as an Aquarius, I'm here for it. As an Aquarius, I am so here for it. It is high time. The truth telling, right? The blunt honesty that people don't like, right? Because you're supposed to just say what people want you to hear. You're not supposed to tell them what it actually is. That doesn't work for a lot of these folks. It doesn't work for folks. I was on a call yesterday and somebody kind of like put me on the spot to talk, but like the language, I took it so literal, right? I took it very literal, like they want you to be a host. And I was like, but I'm not a host. And so like I declined, just yesterday, I declined it. And I was like, oh, now I look like I'm being a difficult person. But like, my social anxiety, like and then there's also that defiance of like, well, no, you can't volunteer me. I didn't volunteer myself. There's very like that defiant, rebellious, ask authority, ask questions. People don't like that. They didn't like that. They just want you to read the Bible. They just want you to read these textbooks. They want you to read this history, but that's banned. And just don't ask no questions. Don't ask no questions. Just follow the orders. And some of us are like, no, why would we follow that order? That's a terrible order. That's a terrible order. It's chaotic. It's self-destructive. It's not good. And they're just like, zip it. Right? So yeah, that's all I wanted. Episode 10 was my favorite. Listening to the spellers themselves, I was shook. I was like, what? You call yourself light workers? Oh, no. We've got a problem. They're doing light work? Yeah, thank you. Thank you for your service. Thank you for whatever you guys are doing up on the hill. Thank you for living. Thank you for existing. Thank you for surviving. Thank you for being here. Right? I'm so sorry that the world treats you this way. I'm so sorry. Like, it's just, they're powerful. I felt the power. I don't know if anybody else felt the power, but I think we felt the power. I think that's why it's doing so well. There's something there. It's powerful. It's very, very powerful. It's very, very, very powerful. The lucid dreaming, you're like, now they're talking about lucid dreaming? Shh, come on. Like, some of this got to be gay kept, right? Some of this was also like, I was talking to one of my mentors years ago, who's an initiated priestess. You know, and she was talking about like hieroglyphics and secret societies. And like, again, a lot of our cultures, you look at the Yoruba culture, right? Ifa. A lot of that was like underground, secret societies, because the world's not ready for it. So you have to gatekeep some of that. And that's my concern with more and more white people doing it, because they don't know really how to gatekeep, first of all. Or they do in a way that only benefits them. And I don't see that happening here, right? I don't see that happening here, which is what I think is the most scariest part. So many gems were dropped. Nick was dropping gems. Jackson was dropping gems. Like, it just was like mic drop, mic drop, mic drop. They're talking about love, right? You need love to access it. You need to raise your vibration to access it. And it's like a couple of episodes ago, I was talking about the climate and how, I think it was Irene Wolfstone was talking about how we confuse death with love. Bell Hooks talks about how we confuse abuse with love. A lot of us don't know love. Love is very threatening because love is the most highest vibration. You cannot defeat love. As much as they think, you cannot. You cannot pull a fast one on somebody who's tapped into that vibration of the universe. Because all those secrets then become, the universe is the secret, the spiritual, right? But we frame that as spirituality. We frame that as new age. The new age shit pisses me off because that's actually appropriated old age. But then the old ways don't work here because we're also in a modern world. So I understand that romanticization of the old ways that no longer will work here. So we're caught in this, like, trying to bring the past into the future, but we're already in the future and we're trying to come here. And it collapses time and place. What is time? Time is no longer real. I saw somebody clocking the Gregorian calendar, clock it. Africans were saying we have like 13 months, not 12 months. Now Trump wants to get rid of daylight savings time. Also, time is not real, but gender is. But gender is not real, right? And as soon as you collapse all of these binaries, it's game over. It's game over for that Eurocentric framework. It's game over. They don't want game over. They've enjoyed dominating for hundreds and hundreds of years. They've enjoyed it. They're not going to give it up. So it's an hour. That's all I have to say. I have a chapter I wrote on this. I'm going to revisit it. I have 2 chapters on this topic where I use Octavia Butler. The evening, the morning, the night, drifting into solidarity, where that talks about what was DDG, right? Octavia Butler, she wrote them as like this, the disease they had, the disorder they had was called DDG. Here it might be autism. So I used that, and then also Kindred, where she's going back into the past, where Kindred, Dana, the character, the protagonist, Dana, collapses time and she's time traveling. So I use those 2 books to kind of have these non-normative conversations that you cannot have in academia. I had to remove those chapters. I had to remove those chapters from my PhD dissertation because it wouldn't fly. You cannot. It's very scientific. It's very Western. It's very white. And I could not. I had to remove it. If I wanted to get my PhD, I had to remove it, and I removed it. And now that I'm done my PhD, I want to revisit it. Not yet. I have a few projects beforehand, but that's one of the things I'm going to revisit is like how to. At this point, it's probably creative nonfiction. Yeah, that's all. I let, yeah, my mind was blown. The telepathy tapes completely blew my mind. I didn't even know what to do with it. Girls, oh no, Aira is also, I gotta go. My cats are, I can also, that's another thing. Telepathy with the animals, that came up as well too. This is just a lot. It was a lot. I was overstimulated. I was excited. I felt normal. I felt validated. I felt affirmed. We are not worthy. The world does not deserve you all. Keep push through, push through, push through, push through, right? It's also very normal. It's actually not supernatural at all. Intuition is not supernatural. We all have access to intuition, but they don't want you knowing that because now you have agency. Now you're making decisions for yourself. They don't want that. Now you can clock with gaslighting. They don't want that. You're not easily controlled. You cannot easily control a body like that. Anybody on the spectrum, you cannot easily control us. Hello, no. For what? Why would you even want to control people? And because they're not easily controlled, it's just shut it down, censor it, hide it, make them think, tell them, the reputation came up a lot. Again, reputation came up a couple episodes ago when we were talking about the Walmart thing, right? As all of a sudden now your reputation is on the line. White supremacy, that reputation, the KKK, that reputation, that's okay. Cutting people's testicles off and keeping as a souvenir, that reputation is fine. But now believing in telepathy is where you draw the line on reputation. Okay. I mean, I guess. But that doesn't sound normal. To me, that doesn't sound normal. And that's where it's just so backwards. The world we live in is so backwards. And for those of us that are clocking it, there's a price to pay. I wish they had talked about, there's a price to pay. And I think listening to it, you see the price that's paid, right? You see the fear people have in talking about this. It is super weird though, right? I get it. It's super, super weird. It's like wacko, right? But that's all. Until next time, in solidarity.